Hey guys, today we're in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 5. And so now that Saul is dead, David is around, we see in the very first verse that all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron. Remember, up to this point, only Judah, one of the 12 tribes, claims David as the king. But now all the tribes, all of Israel comes and they say this line. They say, "We are your bone and flesh." They are identifying David and allowing David to identify as them. And you would read that and you think that's kind of weird because David, of course, is a Jewish man. But remember, he's been living with the Philistines for a good part of almost 10 years now, right? So he's been there with the king. He kind of has made friends and a part of the Philistines. But here, all of the tribes of Israel come together, recognize him as a Jew, and they recognize him as their king. And they say, and the Lord said, "You shall be the shepherd of my people, and you shall be the prince over Israel." All of the elders of the 12 tribes are agreeing with God that he's going to be the next king. So they anoint him king over Israel, and we see that David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. And now, an interesting fact is, if you remember all the way back in 1 Samuel, Samuel anointed David when he was about 15 years old. So he has been anointed as a king by Samuel for 15 years. 15 years of being trained up before he actually becomes the king at 30 years old, and then he becomes the king. Now, when it says 40 years old, it's not 40 years old, 40 years from this moment. It's counting the years before, the 7 years and 6 months where he was a king just over Judah, and he will rule over all of Israel for the rest of the 40 years, those 32 years and 6 months. And so he is now king, and the king and his men went up to Jerusalem among the Jebusites. Now, we know Jerusalem, but up until this point, Jerusalem is a small Canaanite city. It is not the Jerusalem that you think of in your mind. It was actually a stronghold of the Jebusites, which was a group of Canaanites. And so they're going there, and Jerusalem, being kind of on the top of a hill, is a very easy, defensible city. The Jebusites who were there were making fun of them and saying, "There's no way you're going to take it," right? There's absolutely no way you're going to take it. The blind, the lame, no way. There's no way that you're going to be able to take Jerusalem because it's such a great city. But we see with the Lord, David does take it, and we see that they take it with a water shaft in verse 8. It's known as the Warren's water shaft. If you could go to Israel and you could see it, but basically, because they're on top of a city and it's fortified, there would be a shaft coming down, getting water that would be coming up. And so somehow they got in this and they popped up in the middle of the city, and that's how they would take over Jerusalem, defeating the Jebusites. And after he defeated them, because of how easy it is to defend it, he makes it basically the capital of Israel. He makes it his new home. We see that David lived in the stronghold, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord of the God of hosts was with him. And he became such a great king that we see Hiram, the king of Tyre, comes and builds him a palace. And so he brings him all these fine woods. He does everything. And we see in verse 12, and David knew three things, and these three things are important that David knew. Number one, that the Lord had established him. The Lord gave him kingship, not himself. Secondly, that the Lord exalted his kingdom, not himself, but the Lord. And then lastly, the Lord has done all this for the sake of God's people, not for the sake of David. David understood that he was king for a higher calling and a higher power. And so because he knew that, not only knew that in his mind, but knew that in his heart, the Lord did very well and allowed him to be a good king. But After all of this goodness, we see in verse 13, David continues to sin. It says he takes more concubines. Deuteronomy chapter 17 tells us that this is a sin, and he becomes more and more wives and more kids. So even though he's a good king and he is following God, he's still living in sin. And so he has all of these kids that you read through, but what's interesting is the more kids he has becomes the more troubles he has. And so Israel would have saw, look at all of these kids as a blessing, and he would have saw them as a blessing, but they will end up being his curse. Let's see, verse 17, when the Philistines heard about David, they went up. They went up against war, right? So he defeated the Jebusites. He's there, and now the Philistines are coming because this is David. They know David. This is David, the traitor to them, right? And so they're coming up to wage war with them. But notice verse 19, it says, David inquired of the Lord. David asked the Lord, what should I do? Should I go against them? And the Lord said, oh, absolutely go against them. I'm going to give them to you and you will wipe them out. And it's exactly what happened. But then in verse 22, it says the Philistines came up yet again. And so they wipe them out once and the Philistines go back and now they come again. And David inquired of the Lord a good, once again, a good thing, asking the Lord, should I do this? And the Lord says, no. And he gives them a different plan. What's interesting is it's the same enemy, but it's a different plan. Not every battle is the same. And so the Lord tells him to go around the side, to do this, to wait for a moment. But notice in verse 24, it's a very important verse. He says, wait into the trees until you hear a noise, and then the Lord has gone out before you. The Lord was going out to wage war first, and then David and his men were coming in. It's not David and his men giving the victory. It is the Lord giving the victory. And so as we read this verse, we see a lot that's happening, but we see the heart of a man who is truly cares and wants the things of God, but yet we see a man who is full of sin and who is having many concubines and many kids and living this way. Even though he is a great man, he is of sin. And so this becomes important as we start to look at the future, that Jesus is a type of David, that he is a king of David, but he is a David that is good and is godly and is following the Lord's will, but he is a David that is without sin, who does not keep falling into these old things that David keeps falling into that will lead to his demise. That Jesus is the perfect one, and that's what makes him the good or the best David. Hope that makes a little bit more sense, and we will see you tomorrow in chapter 6. God bless.